Well, fifth graders, if you so choose, I will read this story aloud. Remember, if you are choosing this option, that your eyes need to be on the paper, so you should not be looking at me reading the story unless I stop to talk along the way. You should be following with your eyes on the paper as you're listening. That's what's going to help you to become a better reader, is for you to be looking, reading along, following word for word as I am reading to you. Okay? So, Oliver Hyde's Dishcloth Concert by Richard Kennedy. Now, maybe it's sad and maybe it's spooky, but there was a man who lived just out of town on a scrubby farm, and no one had seen his face for years. If he was outside working, he kept his hat pulled down and his collar turned up. And if anyone approached him, he ran up the hill to his house and shut himself inside. He left notes pinned to his door for a brave errand boy who brought him supplies from town. The people asked the boy what he heard up there in that tomb like house when he collected the notes and delivered the supplies. Darkness and quietness, said the boy. I hear darkness and quietness. The people nodded and looked at the boy. Aren't you afraid? The boy bit his lip. A fellow has to make a living, he said. Sometimes the children would come out of town and sing a little song up at the house and then run away. They sang, The beautiful bride of Oliver Hyde fell down dead on the mountainside. Yes, it was true. The man was full of grief and bitterness. He was Oliver Hyde, and his young bride's wagon had been washed into a canyon by a mudslide, and it killed her, horse and all. But that was years ago. The children sang some more. Oliver Hyde is a strange old man. He sticks his head in a coffee can and hides his face when there's folks about. He's outside in and he's inside out. It was too bad. Oliver used to have many friends, and he played the fastest and sweetest fiddle in the county. And for the few short weeks he was married, his playing was sweeter than ever. But on the day his wife was buried, he busted his fiddle across a porch post, and now he sat, cold, dark, and quiet on his little hill. No one had visited him for years. There was a reason. You shall see. One day a man came from the town and walked up the hill toward Oliver's house. He was carrying a fiddle case. 2 or 3 times he stopped and looked up at the house and shook his head, as if trying to free himself from a ghost, and continued on. He arrived at the porch steps. All the window shades were pulled down and it was dead quiet inside. The 3 porch steps creaked like cats moaning in their dreams, and the man knocked on the door. For a little bit it was quiet. Then there was the sound of a chair being scooted across the floor. A voice said, Come in. The man opened the door a crack and peeked inside. Oliver, he said, it's me, Jim. No answer. Jim opened the door farther and put a foot inside. It was dark and smelled stale. Jim opened the door all the way. Off in a corner where the light didn't touch sat a figure in a chair, perfectly upright, with his hands on his knees like a stone god, as still and silent as 1,000 years ago. The head was draped completely with a dishcloth. Not a breath ruffled the ghost head. Jim swallowed and spoke. Haven't seen you around lately, Oliver. No answer. People used to visit Oliver for a while after his beautiful bride fell down dead on the mountainside, but this is how it was. Oliver sitting in the dark with a dishcloth over his head, and he never spoke to them. It was too strange. His friends stopped visiting. All Jim wanted was a single word from Oliver, yes or no. He had a favor to ask. He was Oliver's oldest friend. He moved inside. Sue's getting married, Oliver, he said. No answer. You remember my little girl, Sue? She's all grown up now, Oliver, and mighty pretty, too. For all the notice he got, Jim might just as well have been talking to a stove. He cleared his voice and went on. The reason I came, Oliver, was to ask you to come and play the fiddle for us at the dance. We was the best friends, and I don't see how I can marry off Sue without you being there to fiddle for us. You can just say yes or no, Oliver. Now, Oliver wasn't dead himself yet, so he still had feelings, and Jim had been his best friend. They had played and fought together, fished and hunted, and grown up together. So Oliver hated to say no, just flat out like that. So he said instead, no fiddle. Jim was prepared for that, and he laid the fiddle case down on the floor and flipped it open. So Oliver says, no fiddle. What do you think he means like that by that? And Jim's response is to put a fiddle down by him. So when Oliver says no fiddle, he's saying, I don't have a fiddle. Which, if you think back earlier in the story, we learned why Oliver didn't have a fiddle. Maybe you can remember why he doesn't have a fiddle anymore. The author told us that Oliver broke the fiddle after his wife died. So Oliver says, I don't have a fiddle, right? And then Jim gives him a fiddle. A fiddle, by the way, is like a violin. So he's talking kind of like a violin. Here, I brought a fiddle, Oliver. Porky Fellows was happy to make a lend of it. Oliver felt trapped now. He was silent for a long time. Then finally he said, Tell you what, I can't wear this dishcloth on my head and fiddle. But if everyone else wears a dishcloth, I'll come. Jim was quiet for a long time, but at last he said, All right, Oliver, I'll ask if they'll do it. The dance is tomorrow night at Edward's barn. I'll leave the fiddle here, and if I don't come back to pick it up, then you got to come to the dance and fiddle for us. I got your promise. Oliver smiled under his dishcloth. They'd be fools to agree to that. So you can't have any fun with a dishcloth on your head. So long, Oliver, Jim said. Oliver didn't answer. Jim went back on down the hill. Oliver took the dishcloth off. The fiddle was laying in the light of the open door. He sucked a whisker and looked at it. Oliver knew the fiddle. It was a good fiddle. He wondered if it was in tune and wanted to pick it up, but he let it lay there. His foot was tapping, and he slapped his knee to make it stop. He laughed to himself and muttered, Them donkeys, what do they know? Then he got up and moved around the little house on his dreary business. The sun went down, and the shadow of the fiddle case stretched across the floor. Oliver's eyes kept landing on the fiddle, and he stepped over the shadow when he crossed that way. It looked to him like the bow had new horsehair on it, but it didn't make any difference to him. He figured he'd never be playing on that fiddle, and he never touched it. Next morning, Oliver watched down the hill for Jim to come and tell him the deal was off and to get the fiddle. Noon came. Oliver ate some beans. Afternoon came on. Jim didn't show. Starting to wonder if everyone said, Yeah, we will wear dishcloths. Oliver began to get mad. He was mad that he had ever made the promise. It started to get dark. Those cluckheads, Oliver said, pulling the windows shut. They can't dance with dishcloths on their heads or drink punch either. They'll have a rotten time. But a promise is a promise. Finally, he decided it was time to put his hat and coat on. They tricked me, Oliver grumbled, but I got a trick for them too. They'll be sorry I came to their party. It wasn't a great trick Oliver had in mind, but just a miserable little one to make sure nobody could have any fun while he was there. He figured they'd ask him to leave shortly. He wouldn't even bother to take off his hat and coat. He headed down the hill with the fiddle and into the little town. He entered Edward's barn with his hat pulled down and his collar turned up. It was dark except for two bare hanging light bulbs, one over the center of the barn and one at the end where a sort of stage was built up. Oliver had played at shindigs there many times. He kept his head down, and only from the corners of his eyes could he see all the people sitting around the walls. Lord, it's awfully dark, Oliver thought to himself, and quiet. I figure they know that's the way I like it. He got under the light bulb that hung over the stage and took out the fiddle. So remember, we're kind of thinking about, when we are trying to identify that falling action, we're kind of thinking about whether Oliver chooses to kind of stay lonely and sad, or does he choose to connect and make friendships? And so as we're thinking about the coming pages, be thinking, what does it seem to be that Oliver is choosing? And then when do we know for certain kind of his final choice for the story, that whether he's choosing that happiness and connection or loneliness and sadness? He tuned down to a fretful and lonesome sound, and then he played. Of course, he knew they were all looking for happy dancing tunes, so first off, he played a slow and sad tune about a man who was walking down a long road that had no ending and was gray all about. And the man was looking forward to being dead because it might be more cheerful. Nobody danced, naturally, and didn't clap either when Oliver finished it. That's just right, Oliver thought. I'll give them a wretched time. And he started on another. The second tune he played was even slower and sadder, about a man who thought his heart was a pincushion, and it seemed to him that everyone was sticking pins and needles into it, and it was hurtful even to listen to it. Nobody danced, and nobody even moved to the punch bowl to get their spirits up. Now they're sorry I came, Oliver thought. Still, he had played that last tune especially sweet, and he expected someone might have clapped a little just for that, even if it was sad. Oliver looked out a little under his hat as he retuned a bit. He tried to see Jim. He ought to come up and say hello at least, not just let him stand there completely alone. And he wondered where the other musicians were. 4 people were sitting down off to the right of the stage. That would be them. Oliver considered it would be nice to have a little slide guitar on these slow ones, sort of mournful played, and a mouth harp and mandolin would fit in nice. Nah, this is just the way I want it. One more gloomy song and they'll ask me to leave. So we're kind of noticing that Oliver's starting to wonder, well, why isn't Jim coming to say hi to me? And maybe I would like some other musicians to accompany me. But then he kind of goes back to, no, I want to stay alone. Soon then he played another, this one about a man who had a wife that just recently moved to heaven and how roses grew all over her tombstone even in the winter. Oliver was halfway through that before he remembered that he'd played that tune at his own wedding party. He pulled up short a bit then, but kept on playing it out, and a tear rolled down his cheek. Well, nobody could see. He wiped his eyes when he was finished. Nobody clapped and nobody moved, just sat against the dark walls perfectly still. Among the dark figures was a lighter shape, probably the bride in her white gown. Oliver remembered how lovely and happy his bride had been, and he felt a little mean when he thought about that, giving out such sad tunes. He spoke out loud the first words that were spoken since he came in. Well, I guess you're all ready for me to leave now, and I will. But first I want to play just one happy tune for the bride, and so you can dance, and then I'll go. Then he did play a happy one, a fast one, carrying on with fiddling lively enough to scramble eggs. But nobody got up to dance. And when he finished, nobody moved or made a sound. Look here, Oliver said, I reckon you can't dance with those dishcloths over your heads. I forgot about that. So take 'em off. I'll give you another dancing tune, then I'll go. And then he went into another as sweet and light and fast as anyone ever could, something to get even a rock up and dancing. But nobody moved. And when he was finished, they all sat silent with their dishcloths still on their heads. Come on, Oliver said, take those things off your heads. You other fellows, get up here with your music and help me out. Let's have some dancing, drink some punch, let's get alive now. He stomped his foot 3 times and threw into a tune that would churn butter all by itself. But the other 4 musicians sat perfectly still, and so did everybody else. And Oliver was standing there under the light bulb in silence when he finished that tune. He stood there with his head down, understanding things, and how it felt to be on the other side of the darkness and silence, when all you wanted was some sign of life to help out. So Oliver at this point is reflecting that for the last however many years, every time someone came to talk to him, he would shut them out, he would ignore them, he would keep them far away and wouldn't interact. And now he's on the other side of it, where there's people there and they're ignoring him and not interacting with him, and it's making him realize how horrible that feels. Then he leaned over and put the fiddle in the case and closed it. He said one last thing, then walked out from under the light toward the door. Okay, he said. It's a hard lesson, but I got it. When he opened the door, he bumped into someone sitting next to it against the wall, and the fellow fell off his chair. Oliver put a hand down to help him up, but the fellow just lay there. Oliver touched him. What's this? He felt around, then shoved back his hat for a look. It was a sack of grain he'd knocked over. And the next person sitting there was a sack of grain too. And the next was a bale of hay. Oliver walked completely around the barn. All the people were sacks of grain and bales of hay sitting against the dark walls. And the bride was a white sack of flour. The four musicians sitting off to the right of the stage were four old saddles sitting on a rail. So Oliver realizes that there actually weren't any people in the barn at all. It was all just farming things. When Oliver came around to the door again, he heard music. He stepped outside and looked down the street. A barn near the end was all lit up and lots of people were moving about. He went back up on the stage, got the fiddle, and headed down the street. Jim was standing by the door. "Waiting for you, Oliver," he said. "We're just getting underway. Come on in." When he led Oliver inside, everyone became quiet. First one little group of people, then another, until at last everyone was silent and looking at Oliver. The bride and groom were holding hands. Jim made a motion, and everyone headed for a chair against the walls. They all took out dishcloths to put over their heads. "Edward's got himself a new barn, huh?" Oliver said. "Yeah," said Jim. "Guess you didn't know that. Uses the old one to store stuff. I should have told you." "It's all right," Oliver said. He looked up on the stage. Four musicians were sitting there with dishcloths over their heads. Then Jim took out a large dishcloth. Oliver touched him on the arm. "Never mind that. And everyone else, too. Just be regular and dance. I'll fiddle for you." Jim slapped him on the back and shouted out the good news. Oliver went up on the stage. Someone got him a mug of punch. The musicians tuned up. Oliver took off his hat and dropped it and tossed his coat on a chair. They lit into a fast, happy tune. They danced and played and sang half the night. Ah, they had a wonderful time, Oliver included. So thinking about that last page, as you're thinking about how you're going to identify the falling action, you really want to think about that moment when Oliver makes a choice to connect and change or to stay the same and stay lonely. Good luck with your homework.